Mhm.
We'll wait a minute. There's a lot of people signing on right now.
Mhm.
All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Seems like there's enough people on. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining the monthly webinar series for the San Joaquin Valley REAP. That's Regional Early Action Planning Program. It's a state of California funded program helping cities plan to increase their housing production, particularly related to the upcoming housing element 6 cycle coming up. So we have a great, another great workshop today, and an esteemed array of panelists talking about the site identification process for new housing. Before we do that, I'll introduce panelists in a second. Let me introduce my co-host, Robert Phipps from Fresno COG. Can you say hi?
How you doing? Thank you for coming.
Robert and I manage the San Joaquin Valley REAP program in terms of the 8-county effort, and every COG or every county has their own program as well. Couple housekeeping items here. If you have a question, we have 3 different ways to ask your questions and engage with the panelists. You can raise your hand. You can use the question and answer function that Robert and I will be monitoring, or you can use the chat box. This is a 1-hour webinar today. We'll have a couple of presentations and then discussion after that. This webinar, just like all the other ones, are eligible for AICP CM credit, and I will, in the chat box, send the course number for that. This webinar is being recorded, and the PowerPoint and the recording will be posted to the San Joaquin Valley REAP website in a couple of days, and you'll get an email with that information. So with that, let's see if there's any initial questions or anything. Nope. Okay, we can go ahead and get started. Let me introduce Brenna first, with Brenna Weatherby with Rincon Consultants. She has a couple of decades of experience in city planning, environmental analysis throughout California, planning, zoning compliance, general plans, specific and master plan preparation, housing element development, community outreach, NEPA, CEQA. Brenna is currently leading housing element updates and public engagement efforts in the city of Carlsbad, Vista, Corona, and Banning, and probably a lot more. So go ahead and say hello, Brenna.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. Excited for today's discussion.
Next, we have Jason Montague.
Montague, yeah.
Montague, sorry. Jason also is with Rincon. He's involved in a wide range of current and long-range and environmental planning projects and leads their housing element site inventory team. He has worked on numerous 6-cycle housing elements in the San Diego Association of Governments area and the SCAG area in Southern California, and Association of Bay Area Governments, and for KernCog. He has experience compiling site inventories, performing AFFH analysis, and writing housing element chapters and housing programs. He has developed a creative GIS-based site inventory tool that he will share with you today to help jurisdictions explain proposed land use changes to the general public and demonstrate RENA compliance to HCD. I'll go ahead and say hello, Jason.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me.
And last, we have Randy Hatch. Randy Hatch is a local land use planner with experience in multiple Valley jurisdictions. He has been working in communities in the Valley for over 4 decades, I believe. So a well-seasoned local land use planner. He's also helping on this regional REAP effort. He holds a master's degree from the UCLA Community and Regional Planning Program. So go ahead and say hello, Randy.
Hello, it all.
All right, so let's turn it over to our panelists. And like I said, we hope this can be a discussion towards the end, so don't feel shy about asking any questions or providing input. Go ahead, Brenna.
Thanks, Michael. So we'll go ahead and just jump right into our presentation here. Jason, if you want to go ahead to the next slide. So first off, we're here today talking about site inventories. Site inventories are one of the most important, if not the most important piece of a housing element. And they are a required piece, as you can see here on your screen. California Government Code does stipulate that the housing element must include an inventory of land suitable and available for residential development to meet the locality's regional housing need by income level. So basically what that comes down to is every jurisdiction must provide a look at how they're going to meet the RHNA that's been assigned to them. And they must show that both in a Excel format that HCD requires, graphically as well, to demonstrate where those sites are located. And we'll get into that a little bit more coming up, but just wanted to first start off the presentation by letting everybody know that the site inventory is required, and it is one of the most complex and difficult pieces to prepare during this update, the 6th cycle update, for a number of reasons. Next slide. So first, we just wanted to touch a little bit on site inventory legislation. Site inventory preparation with the 6th cycle has changed quite a bit. There are a number of pieces of legislation that have been passed since the 5th cycle that have impacted not only how the sites inventories are put together, but also things that need to be taken into account as jurisdictions are putting those inventories together. So I'll run through these pretty quickly. First off, SB 166. In 2017, California legislature passed SB 166, also known as the No Net Loss Law, which requires local jurisdictions to ensure that their housing element inventories can accommodate at all times throughout the planning period their remaining unmet share of the regional housing need. So there are some additional details here that require that jurisdictions can't change the zoning of some of these sites. They downzone these sites. So that is one piece of legislation to take into account as you're moving forward in this 6th cycle. Next, AB 1397, also approved in 2017. Its purpose is to strengthen the obligation of local governments to identify a supply of adequate sites available to meet housing needs. There are a number of things that come into play here. So first, land inventory sites must be available and may only include non-vacant sites with realistic development potential. And that's something that the jurisdiction has to demonstrate within the housing element itself. So it's no longer just easy to say that they are available and that's it. You also have to demonstrate that the sites have a realistic and demonstrated potential for redevelopment during the planning period for the designated income level. Also with this piece of legislation, there's the presumption of impediment for non-vacant sites. So in addition to demonstrating a realistic potential, there's also now a presumption that an existing use on a non-vacant site will impede development if more than 50% of the sites identified as available to accommodate the lower income RHNA are non-vacant. This is something that HCD also wants to see in the approving resolution when the housing element is adopted. So make sure that you take into account that language, and we can provide the language that they're looking for later on in the chat or in a separate email to Michael if jurisdictions are looking for that. There are also stronger infrastructure requirements under this piece of legislation. And then also the re-identification of sites from prior elements are allowed only if 20% of the lower income inclusionary, and by right development is required. Also, there are stricter requirements for sites that are smaller than half an acre and greater than 10 acres. Those sites cannot be used for lower income development. And then there are limitations on assigning unit capacity to sites. So calculating the unit capacity for sites must be based on realistic trends. And you must provide an analysis that demonstrates a history of development of affordable housing at the assigned density. So a site cannot be presumed to accommodate the maximum density permitted unless there are trends that show that that's what's being realized in the jurisdiction over the past few years. Jumping forward, you'll see AB 686 here on your screen. That has to do with affirmatively furthering fair housing. I won't say much on this because I know we touched on it during last month's webinar, and next month's webinar will be focusing on that. I will just say that the sites inventory does need to be discussed in the AFFH portion of the housing element. And the analysis needs to show that sites are not congregated in low resource areas and that they are spread across the jurisdiction. AB 1486 impacts existing practices pertaining to the Surplus Land Act. It adds new reporting requirements and subjects agencies to penalties for non-compliance. This is a piece of legislation that HCD has called out on their website as important to the site inventory. I would say that we haven't seen it come into play as much as some of these other ones, but just something to be aware of that HCD does consider this piece of legislation to be very important. And then also on here, AB 725. This is a relatively new piece of legislation, and it requires that at least 25% of moderate income housing be allocated to sites with zoning that allow at least 4 units of housing, but no more than 100 units per acre of housing. So this is trying to address missing middle, and it really keeps jurisdictions from just assigning the moderate income allocation to single family zones across the jurisdiction. Next slide. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jason to talk a little bit more about the site inventory requirements and the ins and outs of preparing one.
Thanks, Brenna. Yeah, I'll be discussing the more technical side of the site's inventory process and what's required in the housing element itself, and then what HCD requires. So the first thing we'll be talking about is the HCD formatted Excel spreadsheet. So this spreadsheet lists every single housing site that is on the inventory, along with a number of required information. So you can see the snapshot on the screen that shows some of the required information. So you'd need to include the address, APN, the zoning, general plan designation, minimum and maximum densities, parcel size, whether the parcel is publicly owned and who owns that parcel. If it's a public entity, is it the city, the county, et cetera? If the parcel has existing infrastructure available, a short description of the existing use, such as single family residential, parking lot, et cetera. And then whether the site was used in previous housing elements, and then the unit capacity for each site per income category. So those are all the required components of the spreadsheet. And then there's also a few additional columns that you can put any supplemental information on. So what we've previously done on sites inventories is we've included structure age, improvement to land value ratio, floor area ratio, or resource level, which is all kind of good information to tell the story of the site. And if the site is being rezoned as part of this housing element, you'll also need to include the current zoning and land use and the proposed zoning and land use as well. And so you'll prepare this, this spreadsheet, and this is what you'll send to HCD. However, in the housing element itself, you do have some flexibility on how you want to organize your sites. Typically, we've provided a general summary of the inventory in the housing element itself, and then included a either this spreadsheet, the entirety of the spreadsheet, or a summarized version as an appendix. But and the reason the HCD wants this entire spreadsheet is they incorporate it into their master data set of all the sites inventories that they received in the state to just keep track of all of the sites. So the sites inventory also needs to have supporting graphics that show the locations of the sites. So you can show the sites in whatever way makes most sense for your jurisdiction. So for example, you can create multiple graphics to show different regions or neighborhoods of the jurisdiction, or you can show the sites in relation to environmentally sensitive areas such as fire and flood zones, or you can show the sites in relation to fair housing considerations, such as resource level or concentrated area of poverty. And then you can also symbolize the sites however you want as well. So on this example, it's pretty simple. We just showed non-vacant and vacant sites, but you can symbolize the sites by zoning. You can symbolize the sites by fair housing considerations. It's really basically, you can just symbolize it however you think works best for your jurisdiction, and based on the level of detail that you want to show. So the third required component of a site's inventory is the explanation of the inventory in the housing element. So this is where you discuss the assumptions you made, like Brenna said, some AB 1697. I can't remember the ABs, but with the realistic capacity, you can't assume 100% of a site will be developed. So maybe you assume a portion of it is developed. This is where you're going to justify that decision. And just your general site selection criteria will be discussed here. So you can explain where the sites are located in the jurisdiction, what densities are allowed in those zones, what your realistic capacity is that you're assuming for each site, and any other details that you want to describe in this section. And the example showing here is just a snip from our Monterey Park example housing element. And this is the summary table that provides a breakdown of the all of the units per income category, and then a short description of the table, which is a required component of the site's inventory.
Now, if I could interject here, what this all means is for the practicing planner, particularly in the smaller cities, is you've got to get to know your property owners. You need to reach out to them and find out what their plans are for the property. If it is vacant, why is it vacant? If it's underutilized, what plans do they have to develop it or use it in a greater capacity? It's an opportunity and a burden for you to have a lot of interaction with the property owners. And in my practice, I have found that reaching out to a property owner and saying, you've got this 10-acre piece of property, it's underutilized, there's a historic agricultural building on here and nothing else, and it hasn't been used for agricultural in decades. What are you planning to do with that? And I have found that more often than not, they don't know what's going on, and they're anxious to follow the lead of the jurisdiction. Do you think I can sell this? Who do I sell it to? How do I get this developed? And having that type of a dialogue will, I think, provide a whole variety of options that can then filter into these tables. And so that's a way. In past housing element updates, we didn't necessarily do that. I mean, sometimes a property owner would be proactive and reach out to the city, but I think this cycle, the city has to be proactive to reach out to the property owners.
Yeah, I would
Right.
agree with that 100%, Randy, and Jason can attest to it also. It's very important for the city to have that dialogue
Mhm.
with the property owners that are involved, especially if there are land use changes or zoning changes being made to the site to accommodate future development. Nobody wants a letter from HCD at the 11th hour saying that a property owner has come in and said that they don't want to be a part of the housing element. They're going to come back and ask you why you didn't talk to them sooner. So 100% agree, Randy. It's very important to have that dialogue from the early stages of the housing element.
One thing I have found very interesting, it goes on a generational line of the property owners. I have had dialogues with the oldest member of a family that owns a particular property, and they have some vision of reinstituting some historic, most likely agricultural use for the property if it's on the fringe of the city or what have you. And then there is the next generation down that they want to be respectful of their parents' ideas. And then you have the grandchildren, and they're totally uninterested in the grandparents' ideas and concepts, and they're very much interested in working with the city. And so be mindful of who you're talking to in the generational link. You know, it's a classic that I've run into where, you know, after a discussion, I have the grandchildren contact me after we've had the meeting, and they say, well, that's all well and good, but we want to develop the property. We are not interested in keeping this. We all live outside the jurisdiction. This is an albatross around our necks, and we want to generate some income from this property one way or the other, and we just don't want to deal with it. And so be very mindful of who you're talking to when it comes to the property owner.
Yeah, and I would say on that note, that's a really good segue to our next topic about recycling trends. But developer interest is a very important part of that. HCD really appreciates that. They appreciate the outreach. And I mean, if a developer expresses interest in a specific site, or even kind of a general, you know, coming into a jurisdiction and saying, I want to do this sort of development, that's really strong justification for that actually happening. It's really kind of where the rubber meets the road on getting these developments actually built, rather than kind of the theoretical sites inventory analysis. So yeah, it's really important. It's often really hard to get that developer interest, I've noticed. But yeah, I mean, anything like that, letters of interest from developers is very helpful in the overall justification. Yeah.
Jason, actually, I'll just jump in really quick. There's a question from Jane Riley in the chat, which I thought we could talk about really quickly. So her question is, property owner permission required to list a site in the inventory? So HCD's guidance document, their site inventory guidebook, does not state that property owner permission is required. However, they do discuss property owner permission when in regards to non-vacant sites, and that it is one way to provide evidence that an existing use will likely be discontinued during the current planning period. So there's a number of other ways that you can provide that justification, but that's one way. I will say, however, that best practice, especially if there are land use or zoning changes happening, is to contact the property owner. If it's by letter or by email, and to keep a record that discussion has started. So keep a letter, or keep receipts for the correspondence that you've sent, and invite the property owner to provide some input on if they want to or do not want to be included in the process. As I mentioned earlier, nobody wants a letter at the 11th hour on a big site containing your site inventory that the property owner does not want to be included. So although HCD does not state that it is required, we would say it is best practice to do that, especially when there are land use changes and zoning changes being considered for the site.
Yeah, thanks, Brenna. So further justification of a site is the incorporation of recycling trends. So typically, as part of the site's inventory, you would start with the sites that are considered the low-hanging fruit. So this would include vacant sites that are already adequately zoned for residential use. But for most jurisdictions, there isn't enough adequate vacant land to accommodate the RHNA. So that's when you start looking at non-vacant sites. So sites that are that already have a current existing use on them. So along with your criteria for selecting non-vacant sites, you'll need to establish some recycling trends to prove that there is a development history that reflects what you're assuming on the site's inventory. So to do that, you'll choose, you can choose examples of past projects that reflect your inventory and establish these trends. So for example, you could choose a project that shows lot consolidation, a project that achieves a high density with a component of affordable housing, maybe a project in a specific geographic location where you've identified a lot of sites. And then also establish what existing uses are being redeveloped. So for example, excess office space, older single family homes, things like that. And it is often difficult in many jurisdictions to establish these development trends. So you can look at a regional level to see what is occurring in jurisdictions around yours or in jurisdictions that are comparable to your jurisdiction. So in the Monterey Park example that's showing on this slide, the project consisted of lot consolidation of 3 parcels. It has an affordable housing component, and it includes redevelopment of an existing use of 8 residential units, and it achieves a density of much higher than what it was. And 49 units is higher than we were assuming on the site's inventory itself. So this is a really good example of kind of showing that what was assumed on the site's inventory is possible because there are trends for that happening in this jurisdiction. So these trends just need to reflect your inventory.
And I think in a lot of the downtowns in the smaller jurisdiction, there are far more land that is zoned for non-residential use, or commercial or office use, than the market could absorb. And so I think that's a good point to look at, talking to the property owners to get them to realize that they don't have commercial property, and that's why it is underdeveloped or vacant, and that the real feasibility of development is in the housing realm. And you know, that's where Jason's comment, you could point to, that's what's been developed in similar cities or elsewhere in the county, and that's really where the market is. And it's coming to a reality discussion with the property owners as opposed to a dream discussion.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would say that, you know, mixed use areas, you know, in downtown area, you know, where there's really only been commercial. I mean, that's a very popular strategy for jurisdictions, especially because in those kind of concentrated areas, there's sometimes it's a higher resource area or better access to transit. So as opposed to developing at the outskirts of a jurisdiction, you're developing, you know, infill and just redeveloping and making it's profitable as well. It's yeah, having the residential and commercial component in those kind of highly dense areas. Okay, so the next required component is public engagement. Public engagement is an important component for all aspects of your site's inventory, but it's specifically important, or I'm sorry, your housing element, but it's specifically important for the site's inventory. And one thing HCD will look for is how how the sites, how public input impacted the site selection process. So in the public participation portion of the housing element, you'll need to state how, like what changes were made based on public feedback. So in the example showing on the slide, we created an interactive map to gather public comment, where members of the public could click on specific sites and comment on whether the site should be included or not, and leave any sort of comment that they wanted to. And then we also had multiple public meetings to discuss the sites inventory. So through the public meeting process, we established that there was generally a lot of public support in identifying the sites in that northern portion of the area where most of the non-vacant sites are identified. Most of the city is single family, so we didn't identify those. So like Randy was just talking about, identifying and where predominantly commercial is existing, but the city implemented a new mixed use layer in that area. So they wanted to kind of redevelop that area with residential use. And then through this tool, we were able to remove certain sites that the public just didn't like. So I think we removed about 10 sites for various reasons. Sometimes it was existing use. It was an important, whatever the use was, it was important. And other times it was just, I guess, a general dislike of the site. So we were able to use that feedback to refine our sites inventory a bit. And I'll show you the tool very quickly here. I'll drag it in. I have it up here. The survey is closed, so we can't, oh, am I still sharing?
Yes.
Can you see the,
Yeah,
can you see the, I'm sharing? Okay.
yeah.
Okay, so so this is the tool we created just to gather that input. So we have some steps here, instructions, and then we have the ability to filter units and filter acreage. And then you can go in, and the intention was to keep it very simple for the public to use. We could have showed a lot more detail, but this was really just gathering feedback on the sites. So if you click a site, you could previously comment on the site, but you can see the allowable land use, how big the site is, and then the unit capacity. So we've created tools that vary in terms of detail. I would say this is one that's a little bit lighter on detail, but yeah, it's really up to you how you want to show. You can show kind of the resource areas, the zoning, neighborhoods, a lot of things. So, but it's a really important part of the sites inventory process to gather this public participation. It's going to be something that HCD is going to look for.
So Jason, there's another question from Jane in here that I think we can address. Her question, Jason, are you suggesting that the public also needs to okay housing sites?
Not necessarily.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I don't think that they need to okay them. What HCD is looking for is that a jurisdiction has attempted to engage the public, inform them of the process, and try to gather feedback from the public pertaining to the sites inventory in particular, as to the sites that are being presented, and if the public feels that these are good sites or not good sites for whatever reason. So the public doesn't need to okay and buy off and vote, so to speak, on the site inventory. But we've worked in jurisdictions that have discovered through this process that maybe one or two sites in particular are hot button sites for the public, and so maybe it makes sense for that for those one or two sites to be removed from the site inventory. When we worked with the city of Carlsbad in northern San Diego County, we found this to be the case. There was one site in particular that was determined really to not be appropriate by the community, and so the city council did end up removing that site for consideration in the site inventory. And so tools like this allow for that documentation and that input to be provided by the public. this is a piece that wasn't as much required with the 5th cycle. So something really to pay attention to this 6th cycle is how you engage the public, as Jason mentioned, and then how they have been able to provide comments that impact the development of the site inventory.
Right. And I would also say that, so in our Monterey Park example, this housing element didn't require any rezoning. So all the sites we identified already had adequate zoning for the RENA. But when you add that layer of, your rezoning parcels, that kind of creates another layer of public engagement. So I would say the public engagement level needs to be a little bit more heightened and targeted towards that rezone effort. But since we were able to accommodate our units in zones that have already been implemented, and the general plan or the land use element was implemented and everything like that, we were able to keep it pretty simple in this case. And so I just want to kind of differentiate the two, because rezoning really does need that heightened level of effort. So this slide provides a breakdown of all the different components of the site's inventory. So the first step in the site's inventory process is to incorporate what is called RENA credits. So the RENA credits are the number 1 and number 2 items on this list, the pending and approved projects and the ADU development. So RENA credits are essentially units you can take right off the top of your RENA before you even identify any sites. So the pending and approved projects include any projects that are currently in the entitlement pipeline that are assumed to be built after July 1st, 2023, and are expected to be occupied during the life of the housing element. And then, and you also typically state where in the entitlement process these projects are, and what affordability level there are for these units. So if there's any deed restricted units, then you would explain that in the housing element. And then for ADU development, you would establish an annual average of permitted ADUs, and it would be between 2018 and 2021. So for example, if the average ADU count between that time is 10 ADUs, then you can assume that 80 ADUs will be developed over the 8-year life of the housing element. And you also need to establish some affordability levels for ADUs. So in regions like SCAG and ABAG, a regional affordability analysis was done for the entire region, and it was approved by HCD. So jurisdictions could make those assumptions safely. Like I think it was 15% of ADUs would be allocated to lower income, 30% for moderate income, and the rest for above moderate, something like that. Without any sort of regional analysis like that, you can also do a jurisdiction specific analysis, which you would just analyze the ADUs you've been permitting and analyze their affordability. So to establish those percentages.
A question came up in the chat about if your past history of ADUs in your jurisdiction has been little or none, how do you go forward? Well, I think you can make a justification in the housing element that the whole profile of ADUs has risen considerably in the last couple of years. And so the experience of 5, 7, 8 years ago is not relevant to what's happening today. And I think maybe a little bit of creative writing on the jurisdiction's part, and also that's where contact with the property owners and or developers can bolster your argument that you're looking at a substantial increase in the number of ADUs from your jurisdiction's historical average. When I've gone out and talked with property owners in the jurisdiction that I work with, people are saying, I've heard of that, and I want to do something. I've got, an elderly relative, I've got a child that I want to put in an ADU because they're a special needs child or what have you. And there's a real increase in awareness for ADUs and a greater sense of considering them and participating in it. And if they find that a city representative is encouraging, that can go a long way to make that come into reality.
Yeah, I would also say, to add to that, if you've had no ADUs developed in your jurisdiction, and you don't have that type of justification or documentation that Randy's mentioned, if you haven't spoken with property owners who are interested, HCD is, I would say, a little shy on building in ADU assumptions for the next planning period. With that said, we have been successful in getting the numbers pushed a little beyond what jurisdictions are seeing, as long as there's a program included that analyzes ADU development every couple of years. So basically, the program language would state that the jurisdiction is going to analyze ADU trends every couple of years. And if they aren't seeing trends that are on par with their assumptions made in the site inventory, then they will pivot through some series of steps to try and increase that production. So if it's increased education, if it's a reduction in ADU fees, whatever those steps are that they've identified to try and pivot and increase that ADU production, that's what would need to be done every couple of years. So if those trends aren't present, you don't have the justification, it doesn't mean that you can't assume any ADU development. You just have to know that that program is going to need to be included, that requires the monitoring of the program every couple of years.
This is also where you can get some kind of hopefully you're updating your ADU ordinance. And so you have something new that you didn't have a few years ago. And that's where you can really get a return on your efforts, and the public meetings for updating the zoning code and so forth for a new AD ordinance can be part of your publicity program for ADUs, and let the public know that you're making it easier for them and generate some interest. So this is one of the few cases where what you have to do actually turns out to reinforce what you want to do.
Right, and HCD has also offered in the past to review ADU ordinances, which has been helpful. They can only do it on if they have availability, which lately they do not have much. So if you do try that, maybe give them some time. But yeah, they have offered and they have done that before, so it's been helpful. So after the RHNA credits are credited from the RHNA, then that's when you move to the site selection process. So which we discussed earlier, and we'll actually discuss in the next slide as well. So if there aren't enough adequately zoned sites, you'll need to rezone. So there are additional requirements for rezoning. The counties within the San Joaquin Valley are all considered suburban jurisdictions because they're located within a metropolitan statistical area that has a population of less than 2 million. So the default density, which is the density HCD requires for lower income units, is 20 units per acre. So any rezone of sites will need to allow at least 20 units per acre. And the exception to this is if a jurisdiction or if a city has a population over 100,000, it's considered a metropolitan city. So then they would require 30 units per acre to accommodate lower income units. Okay. And then we have a short list, well, relatively short list of site identification considerations. So when you're identifying sites, there are a number of things that you need to consider. If a site is vacant, the analysis is relatively easy because there's no existing use to impede redevelopment. Non-vacant sites need additional analysis to determine if they're good candidates for redevelopment. So here are a few considerations to take into account. So improvement to land value ratio, it calculates if the land is worth more than the improvements that are built on it. So if the land is worth more, then that can be considered an underutilized parcel. You can look at discrepancies between existing use and what the site is zoned for. So for example, if you have a small office with a low floor area ratio on a site that is zoned for high density residential, that could be a good site for the site's inventory. And then likelihood of redevelopment connects to the recycling trends. So what you're seeing in your trends can establish what you're looking for in your sites. Proximity to transit, typically, within a half a mile or so of a station is a good site. It's a good strategy to include. And then age and condition of infrastructure. So if a building is over 30 years old or in substandard condition, there's a higher likelihood of redevelopment. Low floor area ratio. There's ownership patterns. So oftentimes you can rely on lot consolidation to meet the minimum size requirements of half an acre. So, and that's an easier argument to make when the parcels that are next to each other are owned by the same individual. So and that's just more justification on assuming that those sites can be consolidated to at least half an acre and then therefore can support lower income housing. Developer interest, which we've talked about before. If a developer has expressed interest in redeveloping certain parcels at certain densities or in certain locations, that's great justification as well. And then you need to take into account fair housing considerations such as resource area and concentrated areas of poverty. You don't want to concentrate lower income sites in low resource areas or in areas of high concentration of poverty. Available infrastructure is important, especially for lower income sites. You can't identify sites, kind of out in the middle of nowhere that doesn't have any infrastructure for lower income units. You can do that for above moderate. There's flexibility there, but HCD is going to see if each lower income site has adequate infrastructure currently or planned. And if it doesn't have that, then that's definitely a constraint. And then the last consideration is any environmental constraints. So trying to avoid high fire areas, flood zones, steep slopes, and other environmental factors that impede development. So with that.
Commenting on the available infrastructure in the jurisdiction I most recently worked with, there was an area that had sewer and water constraints, and the city did not have funds to address those constraints. And so as part of an urban county, we participated in block grant applications, and we were able to get an allocation, and we put that into programming for sewer and water. And then all of a sudden, what was not possible became possible. And we had considerable property owner and developer interest. And it literally was over a 6-month period that before the first construction occurred, contracts had been given, but the construction hadn't started. But all kinds of applications came into my office, and it was, it was something I just found delightful that the development community and the property owners were responding to exactly what we hoped they would. And we did have a good reaction to providing the infrastructure necessary to accommodate higher density housing.
Jason, there's one other question here in the chat. I know we're ready for questions now, so maybe we can answer this one. The question, how close must infrastructure be for a site to be counted toward low income RHNA? I don't know that there's a distance requirement. The HCD's site inventory guidebook kind of walks you through what to do regarding infrastructure availability. If the infrastructure is available, the sites are considered suitable. If infrastructure is not available, the guidebook states that the housing element must include a program that ensures access and availability to infrastructure to accommodate development within the planning period. So if that program cannot be included, or if there is no way for that program to be carried out, then the site is considered not suitable for inclusion in the site inventory.
Yeah, don't forget your grant programs, as I just mentioned, that can help make that infrastructure possible within the planning period, as well as your CIP. You know, it can be programmed, maybe not in the first couple of years, but in some of the out years. And again, this is where you need good working relationship with your council and commission members, as well as your fellow professionals at City Hall, you know, your engineers and the city manager and so on.
All right, any other questions? Jason, you were at the end, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, that's it.
All right, any closing thoughts from our panelists?
You know, I'll just say that the site inventory, we mentioned this earlier, but the site inventory with the sixth cycle is more complicated and complex than ever before, but it's also more important than ever before. You really rely on your site's inventory and the justification of why you picked each site throughout the document. So it does come into play in the AFFH discussion, and you have to really provide that additional justification that shows that the sites are suitable, that you're seeing the development trends that make sense to include the sites that you're including. If you're seeing all your development in your downtown area, say for example, but you're proposing a site inventory that relies on development on the fringes of your jurisdiction, it's probably going to be questioned by HCD if it's not a like for like in terms of what you're seeing in terms of the trends. So it's more complex and a lot more time consuming, but more important than ever. Jason, Randy, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I would echo that. The importance of every decision you make with the site's inventory, you need to be prepared to justify it. So I would recommend trying to establish development trends early in the process. That way, I mean, if you develop them at the end, you've already selected all your sites, it might not match what you've selected. So you can use that kind of development history in your jurisdiction to influence the sites, and that makes it a much better, more realistic inventory.
Right. So if I'm a local planner, I want to start this as soon as I start my update process and keep it going.
Yeah.
Because it's an iterative process here.
Yeah, and then through
the
the housing element as well, continue to track your development and how well you're doing in regards to achieving your RHNA. And it'll make next housing element way easier too if you continue to track all that, and just make sure that what you're showing in the site's inventory is what you're achieving on the ground. So
Yep. And then that Excel template you showed, that's HCD provided template, I'm sure.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I believe you can get it from the website. I've had it sent to me, so I'm not sure where, but we can provide that.
Yeah, I've seen it. I've seen
Okay.
it. Okay, and Natalia from Merced wants to know if the interactive map that you use is live.
Not this one, no. It ended. This is a SCAG region housing element, so their due date already passed, so that survey is closed right now.
We do, Jason, are any of the ones that we've prepared for the Bay Area live yet? I will say also, if you don't have any Bay Area one, if we do, we could send a link to Michael. He could disseminate to the participants. And then I'll also say we're working on a draft for the city of Bakersfield, and theirs will be, released at a later date. The one thing we didn't really mention about these web-based tools, the web-based site inventories, is that they're a useful tool not only during the housing element preparation for gathering public information, they're also extremely useful for the years following adoption of the housing element when you're preparing your annual progress reports. So once you already have put the money into having a tool like that develop, it's easy for you then to monitor your sites on an annual basis, and it makes your reporting so much easier as well. So it is definitely something to consider investing in, because it's not only beneficial now, but for the rest of the planning period. Oh, and Jane just added a comment that the Napa Sonoma sites map that we prepared will go live next week. So Michael, I will send you a link to that and you can disseminate it to the participants.
That'd be great. That'd be great. Okay, any other closing thoughts? All right, well, this was very informative. Once again, thank you, our panelists. You did an excellent job helping our valley jurisdictions. So someone else has a question. I'd love to learn more about what other jurisdictions are doing regarding site tracking. If they're integrating in tools like Acela, maybe a future workshop idea. Okay, absolutely. We'll keep that in mind. And so thank you, everybody. We'll stay true to being done by 2 o'clock. And the June workshop is going to focus on AFFH. So that would be pretty important as well. So stay tuned for details about that. So have a great day, everyone. Thank you so much.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.